Okay. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all. Yeah, I'm sure you've noticed that I'll be filling in for Ayya this week. I should be back next week. I'd like to go ahead and sit if you'd like. So you might want to get into a comfortable position. Might let the spine straighten out a bit. Pull the shoulders back. Tuck the chin. Just settle into the body. Feel your knees or your feet on the cushion. See if you can find a sense of groundedness. And just as it's helpful to cultivate a place of stillness and groundedness, it's also helpful to see if you can cultivate a positive mental state. It's a good foundation for your sit. So you might look for pleasant sensation in the body. You might bring to mind a happy memory. Perhaps a feeling of connectedness with everyone on the call. And if you can find one of those, you may put your attention on it. And let it blossom. Like a flower receiving sun. Cultivate these positive feelings as a form of home base for your mind to come back to. Minds are built to wander. Even when you set a strong intention to be present, it will inevitably wander off. But when it returns home to a place of happiness, joy, kindness, the next time it wanders off, it's more likely to return quicker. Whereas if you create a mind that wanders with criticism, irritation, it's more likely to stay out and not come back. So it can be helpful to cultivate a place of peace or kindness or joy at the beginning of a sit. If you feel like you've established a place like that, if it feels good to you, you can take the microscope of attention and point it at the sense of the breath at the nostrils. And you might notice the sensation of the breath arises all on its own. It needs no input from you. So you can just watch. Watch the breath unfold in all its detail. And if you like, you might let awareness expand to encompass all of the sensation of the breath throughout the body. You might let the breath fill the body and illuminate the body. You might see how fully you can perceive that. Where is your mind right now? Sometimes sensations of the breath will have pleasant sensations accompany them. Look and see if you find any of those. If you do find pleasant sensations, if you like, you can let them come to the foreground of experience. Place your awareness there. in the last few minutes of this sit. If it feels good to you, you may let go of all intention. There's nothing to be done. Just exist as the flow of experience. Thank you all for sitting with me. It's good to see you, Dave. So I'd like to talk about the self. There's different ways you can think about it. I will offer one of those ways, and then I'll also offer a way that you can work with it. The self is a misunderstanding. I think it's maybe the most harmful misconception that someone can have. It's the idea that there's some I that is somehow separate or fundamentally different from the world around me. It's the idea that there's some kind of persistent set of qualities or characteristics or feelings that persist with some kind of stability. When you hear this talked about in Dhamma contexts, you'll usually hear the term self. I like the phrase illusory self a little better. I think it better captures the idea. It's an illusion, a misunderstanding. Self is kind of tricky to work with, but it's helpful to do so because that misunderstanding, that illusion of the self, is both born out of our suffering. It's what causes our suffering. It is our suffering. And if we want to not suffer, it helps to understand how the illusion is born. So I have a metaphor for you. Have you ever gone to the grocery store when you're very hungry? Everyone says not to do that, but I'm sure we all have at some point. Do you know that experience? You're walking down the aisles and things just kind of seem to suck you in. You pass the watermelon and you start daydreaming about taking a big juicy bite. You walk down that aisle with all the chips and snacks, and it's like your head is on a swivel. I want this thing, and I want that, and I really want this, and that looks delicious. And then you get to the bakery section, and you see that triple layer chocolate cake. It's just magnetic. I'm sure you know that feeling. And sometimes things push you too. Most people have at least some foods they dislike. Cauliflower, cabbage. Maybe you're feeling nauseous. You walk past a sausage and there's just an instinctive revulsion. When you walk through the store, there are thousands of different products, thousands of different ways that the mind can use to try and control experience. Thousands of different opinions for the mind to have about how the world should be. And so your experience of walking through the grocery store might be this more or less constant stream of being pushed or pulled by things. Sometimes strongly, sometimes not. Sometimes push, sometimes pull. The experience is of constantly reacting to things on the aisles. And this is actually a really good metaphor for our life. Spend our 40, 60, 80, however many years on this planet, moving through the world more or less constantly, wanting something or other. Not just food, of course. We want to be seen a certain way. We want people to treat us a certain way. We want to succeed at work. We want to have power. We want to be safe. We want people to do what we think they should do. We want all sorts of material goods. Life is this constant stream of push and pull. So how does this work? How does this experience of wanting arise? This is from Dignikaya 22, the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, Greater Discourse on Foundations of Mindfulness. The section on the origin of suffering says this. And what is the noble truth of the origin of suffering? It's the craving that leads to future lives, mixed up with relishing in greed, taking pleasure wherever it lands. That is, craving for sense pleasures, craving for continued existence, and craving to end existence. But where does that craving arise and where does it settle? Whatever in the world seems nice and pleasant. It is there that craving arises and settles. And what in the world seems nice and pleasant? Sights in the world seem nice and pleasant, and it's there that craving arises and settles. Sounds in the world seem nice and pleasant, and it's there that craving arises and settles. Smells in the world seem nice and pleasant, and it's there that craving arises and settles. Tastes in the world seem nice and pleasant, and it's there that craving arises and settles. Touches in the world seem nice and pleasant, and it's there that craving and arises and settles. Thoughts in the world seem nice and pleasant, and it's there that craving arises and settles. So let's unpack that a bit. The sutta starts from suffering. How does it get there? Well, craving. And where does craving come from? Whatever in the world seems nice and pleasant. Sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and thoughts. If we flip that around, we can see things in the order of operations as they happen. There's sense contact, pleasant feeling, craving, suffering. You have the experience of sense contact. The sight of the chips, the smell of the bread in the bakery, the taste of those little cheese samples. And that experience can have a pleasant tone to it. This pleasant feeling tone can condition craving, the feeling of, I want that. And I'm talking here about craving, but aversion is the same thing. It's the other side of the coin. It's a feeling of, I don't want that, stemming from negative feeling tone. But here's the key detail right here. Craving or aversion, that push or pull, that resistance to what is, that is our suffering. That is the unsatisfactoriness of life. That's where the misunderstanding that gives rise to a sense of separate self happens. Inherent in that craving, that thought of I want something or I don't want something, is an I and a something else. There's me and there's a chocolate cake, a self and an other, a separation. Does that make sense? Without that separation, there's just experience. Without separation, there's no need to react, no need to suffer by wanting something to be different than it is. There's just the experience without that extra layer of wanting on top of it. And when the sense of separation happens over and over and over again, the mind tends to buy into that. We move through the world experiencing a more or less constant push or pull. You go to the grocery store and are pulled in 100 different directions. You have 100 little moments of being a separate individual in relation to this other thing. You go about your day and have 1,000 different experiences that seem to point to the idea that you're a separate self, if they aren't seen closely. Sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less. Sometimes you walk down the ice cream aisle and get pulled every which way. Sometimes you walk down the aisle with all the paper towels and light bulbs and stuff, and not so much. But it keeps happening. And the mind, when it isn't seen clearly, just buys into all those thoughts. There's an I and a something else in a way that I feel about how the something else should be. And that idea is constantly reinforced. And it builds on itself too. There's a feedback loop wherein the more that you buy into the idea of a separate self, the more you suffer. And the more you suffer, the more the mind tends to try and grasp at things to assuage that suffering. And that is how that seemingly solid sense of self comes about. When you were a very young child, your mind started buying into all this craving and aversion, this separation. It took those thoughts and feelings at face value. And however many millions and millions of instances of craving and aversion since then have reinforced that belief, created into this seemingly solid thing that you feel that you are. That's how that works. And when we misunderstand the world in that way, that I am separate from everything else, we suffer. Life is unsatisfactory. Because that separate I is a hole that's never fully filled. We reach out for things in order to fill that hole, but it can never be fully filled. When you understand the world is comprised of you and other, no amount of embracing further separation will fix that. It will just deepen that divide. There are two outcomes to craving. Either you get what you are craving, in which case you might feel better temporarily, or you reinforce the pattern of reaching for craving and make things worse, or you don't get it and you suffer. And in either case, there's some suffering in craving itself. Some part of us, maybe deep down, but some part of us knows that we're not separate from one another. There's a conflict with what we truly know at the core of our being and this false sense of self that's inherently painful. There's no way to win if you play that game. As long as you do, as long as you play that game of being a separate self, the world will be unsatisfactory. It's not to say that you can't have a lovely life with lots of happiness in it, but you'll never find secure, lasting peace if you believe that you're separate from the world around you. So that's the theory. That's one way to understand the self. But I did want to talk about practice too. So how do we work with this? How do we see through the illusion that's been built up over the course of our whole life? How do we learn to be such that we don't experience craving and aversion? Practice, of course. Time on the cushion and the Eightfold Path in general. And that question of how we practice to see through the illusion of self is at the very heart of practice. All of the practice gets to the idea of that in one way or another. But I wanted to share one particular way of practicing with this, which I think a lot of people might find enjoyable, just to spend time in nature. Much of the sense of self comes from the world of things around us. Not all of it, but a lot. We see ourselves as someone who should have certain kinds of food or creature comforts. We see ourselves as having certain routines around how we should work and where we should go and spend our free time. We want to be seen in a certain way in terms of what material goods we possess or what experiences we have. We want to work with the sense of self that comes from all that. The way to do that is just take it all set aside. Renunciation. So go camping where none of this stuff exists. Go backpacking. Go for a hike. Go for a walk. Set all that other stuff aside and just spend time in nature. Renunciation in general is a big part of this practice. Many other religions recognize this too. All the Judeo-Christian religions do. I remember participating in Lent as a kid, my Catholic parents. Hindus recognize this too, in some shamanic traditions. The Stoics as well. They had a nice teaching, which was to leave your fancy villa, just go sleep outside in your cloak. I like the simplicity of that. Nature is just healing to your soul. It's such a powerful aid to practice in many ways. There's a peace to nature that comes from being without all this stuff, all the things that push or pull us around. It's not to say that we don't have craving around things in nature, but we see aren't specifically designed to pull us around as much as possible. So there's two ways in particular that spending time in nature is helpful in this context. First, when you take away access to all this abundance, the stuff that you're really clinging to is going to rise to the surface. Whatever you create a self around, if you remove that thing, if you don't have access to it anymore, that lack will make itself known. The mind will turn up the volume on some of those cravings, and they'll be easier to see by contrast. The last time I was on retreat, some nights I would sleep very little, and sometimes be up at 2 a.m. ready to go. The place I was sitting at was in the middle of a forest, and what I would sometimes do on those mornings would be to take a flashlight and go walk out some ways in the forest away from the retreat center, turn off the flashlight and just sit in the dark, the sounds of the forest around me. The first couple of times I did that, strong fear arose. This fear was very basic. It was a very fundamental fear. Being completely alone in a vulnerable state, in the dark and the cold, without any evidence of humanity around me. And this isn't something that would have easily come up in other circumstances, but I got to see it, to be with it. The next time you go for a hike, hopefully you'll have a very pleasant experience, but you might take a look at the dukkha that comes up too. This is a good way to practice. Maybe you'll see things that aren't so easy to see in your everyday life. See what you get upset about. Are you worried about being out of contact with your boss for so long? Well, interesting. Do you feel a little bored that there isn't enough stimulation? Interesting. Are you bothered by all the dirt or bugs? Interesting. Self. All of those are self. And different things might arise if you stay longer. One thing that's bothered me a lot in the past is that I have a really hard time sleeping outdoors. I have all sorts of gadgets and supplements and such at home, so I can sleep all right there. I'm pretty limited as to what I can bring when I go backpacking. So I often sleep pretty poorly, and this has really bothered me in the past. On a longer trip, you might notice how attached you get to eating good food. I've heard that one a lot. Backpacking food is not fancy in any way. It's a pain point for many people. Maybe an aversion to being dirty all the time will make itself known, or the physical discomfort that comes from carrying a pack all day. Maybe you'll find that you have a really hard time being away from people for so long. If you step away from things, your mind will show you what it's upset about, what it's trying to construct a sense of self around. And that allows you to work with it. And that is information that's not always available to you when you have ready access to the thing that you're craving. The other reason that spending time in nature away from things is helpful is that it gives you direct evidence that being without those things can be okay. All that stuff in your mind that tells you can't be happy without, well, you can be. One of my big dreams in life has been to hike the Appalachian Trail. If you're not familiar with it, it's one of the big through hikes in the US. It's 2,200 miles or so up the East Coast through some of the most beautiful places in America. It takes maybe 5 months or so to complete, depending on how quick you are. Of course, you need to pass through some towns along the way to resupply and such, but much of that time is spent out in nature. I've met some people who have done that, and I've heard some more people speak about their time. And it seems like there's a very common set of changes that occurs in people who have done this. They become much less attached to material goods. If you spend 5 months living out of a backpack, where every extra ounce you carry is a significant burden, you learn to do without. And you also learn that you can do without. It's pretty typical for people who hike the Appalachian Trail to come home and downsize their life. They'll often get rid of many of their possessions, or move to a smaller place, or maybe find a new job that takes less of their time. When you have direct evidence that you can be happy without all of this other stuff, why bother? And that is one of the gifts of being out in nature, away from many of the things that try and push or pull us around. None of the things that you think you need to be happy, not your favorite food, not your house, not your job, not your phone, not even your comfort or having people around you. None of those things are necessary for happiness. And if you spend time without those things, even if it's for just a short time, you start to see the truth of that matter. Even if it's just a small amount of clear seeing, it still helps to water down the craving. And then whatever error that you had been making, whatever misunderstanding that fueled the feeling of, I need this thing to be happy, or I want this. When you see clearly, you don't make that error so much, or you don't make it again at all. And so you suffer less. It's true whether the clear seeing comes about on the cushion or outside or however it comes about. And if you do that enough, there's nothing left to prop up that illusion of the separate self. And then you don't suffer at all. Life becomes satisfactory, no matter what occurs. That's what I have for you today.